This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And I want to wish you all a season's greetings. It's kind of a strange season with all the virus work. Just going out occasionally with a mask on is interesting, and talking to people a little bit, not too much. But we hope things will change as vaccination comes in. But this is a long-term project. The virus will be around for quite a while, and people don't know, scientists don't know its characters yet. So it's to some extent guesswork. I've been using the time to go through some of my archives, and I came up with one that I thought was useful for you to know. Mary Hussey was a slight woman. She loved to dance. She loved to do drama. She taught at Montessori for quite some time. And the university, this was in about the early 50s or late 40s. The university was doing English classes where you had English speakers and English as a second language people in the same classes, and various people, including Mary Hussey, asked the English department and LAS, Life Sciences, if they could create an English as a second language. And Mary taught that for many years. But she was a native of Williamsville, over near Springfield. And her history is part of the history of most of East Central Illinois. So I've been going through it and kind of interested. You have to have a historic group that is interested in this sort of reporting. You have to have people who have family genealogy. Mary Hussey's family grew up in Williamsville, and they came here early on. The settlers came via the Ohio. They'd go down the Ohio to places like Shelbyville, and then take a covered wagon to Illinois. Depending on the season, it was very tough going because the prairie was hard to get through, and the wet places, and this area was wet, were very boggy, and it wasn't a very pleasant trip. Some people went right down to Cairo, where the Illinois and the Mississippi and the Missouri come in, and then they took flat-bottom boats up the river, especially when it was a little flooded, so that you had enough water to be able to get there. So early settlement was on the rivers, and early industry was near to the rivers because often there were groves, like the Urbana Big Grove, and they provided some protection from the wind, and also there was lumber. They could be cleared, and forest soils were thought to be more productive for a while. Eventually, it was realized that the prairie soils were really the most productive. So they settled in these places, usually located in the grove. And the groves were small. 10 square miles might seem large, but it's small in terms of several counties. Uh, these people came before there was a canal across the northern part of the state, and before there was a railroad. The later settlers came with a railroad, so they could come as far down as Cairo. Uh, there is the southern part of uh, Illinois has a number of names that are Egyptian, and so this is not Cairo, Egypt. This is Cairo, Illinois, and Cairo, Egypt would be a Cairo, and Cairo, Illinois is Cairo, and then you would find your way up the river. Sometimes there would be paddle wheelers with a paddle at the back, or paddle wheelers as paddles on the side. Uh, they had low draft. They had to have low draft, so they were flat bottom boats, sometimes with a little bit of keel, but mostly they were dealing with snags and water that was shallow. So it paid to come when the spring flush gave you enough water to have a draft. The early settlers settled near to the rivers, and uh, then when the railroads came, it was much more efficient to get on a railroad car and get to Springfield. Well, Williamsville is probably about 10 miles east of Springfield, and the railroad line went through. So you have to know that sometimes uh, the town that was platted may not have been on the railroad. If it if that was the case, the small settler town moved their houses, getting them across the snow to the new location to be near the railroad. Then the railroad created a, a settlement. So the railroads were given money to have to put the railroad in. So you had plats, and if the railroad went at a diagonal, then the uh, platted town was parallel or vertical to the railroad, and that plat was different from the east-west Jeffersonian plat, which was put together by Jefferson, basically because people were finding it hard to find their plot of land that they'd bought sight unseen in anticipation of coming here. And if you didn't have any survey line and the tree had died or the stone had moved, or you were not sure what your property lines were. So uh, the two plats come together, and we've spoken about this before. It results in uh, having some buildings that are flat iron buildings. They're at an angle because one side is facing the Jeffersonian east, west, north, south plat, and the other side is facing the railroad plat. And so we often are working with towns that have this situation. Uh, the early people were the first store owners, the first to build a house. To build a house, you had to have lumber. You could do it out of raw logs, and you could have a broad axe and adze to tidy up the beams so that they were somewhat square, and you could chink the logs uh, with paper and clay and make yourself a log cabin home. Uh, this was late enough in the 1830s that people were used to sophistication in the East. They came prepared to settle in the West and to face some problems, but they came with ideas. If they had a log cabin house, it might have a Greek revival front because they were aware enough of architectural design to know that they could put a porch on and create a Greek revival cottage. Uh, the roads were very muddy. This was wet territory. So people were always putting down planks so that you could walk on the planks. Planks aren't easy to walk on because when they get wet, they get very slippery and you can end up on your backside very quickly. Uh, to avoid that, they would make roads of corduroy. So the carts with big wheels could go across the a setting of saplings, and the saplings probably had to come in from elsewhere because there were not a lot of saplings in the area. You were near the Sangamon, so there may have been some cutting of trees, but forests to the north in Wisconsin and to the south, Texas and Alabama and places like that provided lumber. And the lumber had to come in at first by horse and cart. And early settlement might have been in a one-room cottage uh, where you had sometimes a rather large family and you had uh, people sharing beds or uh, sharing time to go to sleep. But this was productive area. Uh, First of all, you could grow cattle, and later you could grow crops. You had your own vegetable garden. There was no store nearby. The first businesses were usually store, except for grain. If you were near a railroad line, then there was a grain elevator. And it was an icon for that town. Probably 60% of the workers in the town were working with the railroad or with the elevators. Uh, as things got sophisticated, you had the need for schooling. So the early school teachers were probably male. Later, most of the school teachers were often female. Uh, there were churches that were set up in small homes. Uh, so you see that today still in Amish country where people actually have houses that are big enough to invite people in and come by sulky or dray or whatever they arrive by. You need sometimes walls that break down so that congregation can meet. Uh, Gradually, you get churches, and then you get improved churches, and then you get quite fancy churches. Uh, the people that were in this district seem to be basically uh, British with British names, and some of them had Welsh names, so you have to wonder. Is coal underneath Springfield, and it's not quite as accessible as a Danville, but it's there and it provides heat. So some people nearby set up a town with a mine, and if you see a Welsh name, it might be that the Welshman has been used to mining in Wales and has come here and is seeking employment to do that. Uh, the women folk were fairly heavily involved, even though they might have been dressed in a manner that might be not as convenient for working in the field. They did a lot of the work. They helped to plant and helped to harvest, and they provided the food, and also they uh, provided some of the leadership to get things underway. Uh, uh, well, Mary was a regional citizen. She uh, got to be a professor at the University of Illinois and teach English as a second language and meet and greet people from many countries. She passed on. uh, she must have had chicken pox in her early days because she died of the virus still erupts for people in old age, and I forget the name of the disease that follows, but she died of that disease, and it's very painful. It's not a good passing. Mary lived in a big old mansion, which was a fraternity right on campus, next door to the store that's on the corner of Wright and Green Street. And it was a fraternity until probably the middle 30s when Depression hit and fraternities lost their capacity to survive. So the Dallenbauer family bought that, and Mary Hussey had friends who lived there, and they were thespians. They provided the clothing for drama festivals and worked with places like Granite. So this retired fraternity became a Southern Tea Rooms, and it was a dignified place where you didn't dare go with your working clothes. You had to be dressed appropriately, and the women had to have gloves and appropriate chapeau, I would think, and the men had to have be suited, and so Mary was a part of that, and we miss her. We used to live in the same complex when the restaurant retired because the University Union made a place for the board members of the university. They used to meet at the Southern Tea Rooms because it had a big ballroom that probably was where fraternity people would have slept. The building was actually taller than the next door buildings. It is now the co-ed theaters. There's two theaters there in that general area. And McDonald's bought the property that was the fraternity that became the restaurant. Uh, so quite a few of these people who were working hard in the 50s, the uh, 1950s, uh, they were friends and relatives and very much living together, uh, often a single life because the depression had made it difficult for people to be married and be assured that they would have enough money to create a family and to support wife and husband. And so it didn't always happen. Uh, uh, these were the people who were the heads of department of drama or costumiers or people who taught English as a second language. And they also met up with people from many countries, many of whom had skills, uh, especially in engineering, that didn't require a lot of second language. But when they had to write a thesis, it was very hard for them to do. Uh, the Hussey family had married into a Slocum family, and some of the Slocums, I think it was, uh, saw things on the other side of the field as being an improvement. And they took off to Oklahoma for a while. And this is a pattern that you find in Illinois. There are people who come this far, or come to Kentucky, they come to Illinois, and then they decide to go west. But after about 10 years, they decide that the family farm in Illinois is probably uh, richer, and they come back. So that happened to Mary Hussey's ancestors. They came back to the family farm. Uh, they were fairly windswept, so these farms often have hedgerows, and the hedgerows are often uh, Osage oranges, and the oranges are like a big apple, and you see them in the fall. They drop down, and if the Osage orange plant or tree is near the road, you will see these balls, and people use them for decoration sometimes. But they're sort of part of the mulberry family, and the wood is extremely hard and very hot, so it's good for fuel for fires. The first fires would be open, uh, probably with uh, heating materials hanging from a beam supported by two forky tree trunks that would provide the support. Uh, Gradually, you would morph from that to a stove, and the stove would have to be fed by fuel. And if you didn't have coal, you had to have fuel. And some of the fuel was very good. You had to season it. The Osage orange fuel was extremely good and very hot, and you could actually burn your cooking up, or worse than that, you could burn your house down if you were using uh, Osage orange. Uh, it got planted all over the state. It got to be a good word that this is a good windbreak. It stopped winds from racing across your field, and especially fields that are open uh, for cultivation. You can lose a skim of topsoil, and it goes into the river along with the chemicals, uh, that you've planted as support, the excess will go into the water and down the Mississippi, and you create a dead situation in the Gulf. Uh, so, having looked at that, I think one of the things I was impressed by gradually uh, the male faction, which had to handle horses and cultivation and a lot of physical things, tended to get hurt fairly easily, and they would leave families. And this was uh, some of this was in the late 80s, 1880s, and so there was a move to create uh, insurance groups. So you have the modern woodsmen, the Indians, these insurances still are around, but in the day, it was interesting that they were given names that related to the Indians who were a difficulty for the settlers, and the settlers were taking over their territory, and things were dangerous. So these bodies are like oddfellows. Uh, they gradually create a list of what they do and don't do. So you had uh, rules of the game, and some of those were related to Europe and what had been brought, and some of them were adapted to local conditions. And so a priest might be following uh, the basic rules that were his learning, but he would adapt, especially to seasons and tornadoes and things like that, uh, so that you cherish certain days that are your location. The railroads did very well. They brought settlers, and gradually you set up a town that was parallel to the railroad line or vertical to the railroad line. If you go to places like Paxton, the working Main Street is parallel to the railroad line. If you go to other places, uh, the Main Street is vertical to the railroad line. But on the railroad flat. And so early on, stores, and then equipment, a blacksmith. You had to have plows, and this prairie soil was very sod bound. It was very difficult to plow. It had to be drained first, so you had to have uh, oxen with cloven hooves that were much more effective than horses to drag a plow or work with drainage to get the water off. Uh, the horses had to be shoed. Uh, that was the job of a blacksmith. And behind all this was music. Uh, these were people who played the violin or their banjo and wrote music and poetry in their spare time. I didn't have much spare time, but that was part of it. The schooling got to be one teacher's schools uh, spread a mound around the county. But then it was a need for a high school, and then there would be a need for a gymnasium. For a long time, the churches were providing some of these resources, especially for physical gymnasiums and things like that. Eventually, that went to the schools, and the churches were still rather strong. I suspect that Williamsville was rather Methodist in its background. And if you have grown up with Methodist people early on, Methodists didn't really have a high regard for dancing or drinking. So there was a general reserve in these little communities. You were expected to dress properly, and women were expected to be subservient to men when actually they did a lot of the leadership. Uh, so having worked with, there must be 100 pages there. Uh, each family gets a chance to say something and give their heritage. The marriages are listed, the births are listed, the first birth in this little town, the first marriage, uh, and it's credit to somebody who has put this together. Let me grab the thing. The guy who was named Cravens, and he did this in 1991. So he's having to remember things that came down to him verbally, because the early settlers didn't have a lot of space for or time for remembering the details. They just got on with it, and they didn't have facilities to write and think and dream. They dreamed, but it was on the go. Uh, at the same time, I was thinking about Farmer City, and Farmer City is about to have a rail trail coming through from Bloomington on a retired Norfolk Southern line. It's a line that comes right through to Champaign, and but it has been abandoned from Mansfield to Bloomington, which I guess would be about 35 miles. I wanted to remind Farmer City that they have a potential trail. It's sometimes a little frightening to communities to all of a sudden have a rail trail through. What do you do with it? Sometimes the planning is 8 years away from you, and by the time it gets to the small town, it's not always being viewed by these citizens of the town. And so I wanted to remind Farmer City that some of this right away, usually about 100 feet wide, with a disturbance in the middle for a ballast for a train, but the soil and the plants on either side are reasonably undisturbed. A little bit on the farm side, a little bit disturbed for invasive farming, because this habitat along the railroad line is really looks like the weeds that the 6 generations of their families have been getting rid of, and it's not using the land for commercial purposes. It's a waste of land. Not so. The right of way is replete with all sorts of bacteria, fungi, plants and animals that are part of the remnant of uh, the region. Uh, these were the plants and animals and microorganisms that grew gradually over a 10,000 year time. They may not have all the species that a prairie would have uh, uh, because the railroad would go through places that have niches. And the niches, if you're going over a moraine, there's high areas that are drier. There are loose areas where there's wind-blown material. There's wetlands that are poorly drained. That range is not represented by all remnant that we have, but it's important to keep the remnants because they're what grows and tells us what used to be. Uh, there's a temptation to look at it as daggy or not looking very good because that's how it is, especially if it's been mown for years and uh, it's adjacent to a railroad and a road that came after the railroad, and it's very tempting for the area to be mown. Uh, but if you stand someone there that's a biologist who knows about prairie and knows the 100 or so species that exist in the prairie, and they see 6 or 7 species standing up and expressing themselves, they start to think about whether this is a prairie or not. And in many cases, it is. You can actually uh, ride that rail bed and see whether there are places that have remnant material. Uh, so some of this railroad bed goes through the farmland without having a road adjacent. But from Palmer City to Mansfield, the area is remnant and alive with prairie. It gets mown fairly regularly, but its roots survive, and the plants that don't like mowing have probably disappeared. But this can be upgraded. You can even take it, and if you have enough niches, you can create an arboretum. You can really give room for 100 species. Not that it'll happen because some of these species have very specific niches, and they're not about to satisfy you by growing in an arboretum. But you can recreate a prairie, especially if you give it a little loving care. So my message for Farmer City, I got a publication. It's called The Mirror, and it's the history of Farmer City. And they have had me to talk to them some years ago, and I know the city fairly well. And its upper limits, uh, from water point of view, run into the Clinton Reservoir. Uh, so there's riparian ways, and probably some of the early settlers for Farmer City were like Williamsville. They arrived by boat, the last elements of which may have been canoe. Uh, the Indians knew how to move around with canoes, with shallow drag, and they know where to portage. That's part of the problem is with some of the upper reaches of the rivers like the Sangamon and the Salt Fork or the Vermilion and the Kaskaskia and the Ombra. They're draining very swampy areas. So if you want to put your finger on the start of the river, you can't. It's like you put out your hand and it's palmate drainage, and it's seepage. And so when people talk about canoeing, they usually start at a point where some of this is coalesced, and it's deep enough to move about, and it's uh, there with livestock like fish in it, and uh, but these are creatures that are adapted to this situation. Uh, Mostly these areas are drained, uh, and they've become agricultural, so uh, they're no longer swampland. But we do in certain places have uh, the remnants of swampland have been retained. There's a nice area just north of Rantoul, which is swampy and it's not good for farmland because of that. But it would be excellent for giving it a transect of swampland, which is an outwash plain for glacier, and you go up the face of the moraine, and uh, you have a transect that is rather unique. Uh, but when we're dealing with trails, we're dealing with recreation rather than with preservation. So you have to be uh, pretty sharp and pretty political to make sure that the prairie that's there, and the prairie is our heritage ecosystem. It's not forest. There are little pieces of forest here and there, but forests are much more attractive than prairie. And besides, we've been getting rid of those weeds, warts, curses, and veins for many years. So we've been taught to regard vacant lots as weed lots rather than as uh, often prime uh, set asides or remnants. Uh, Fortunately, there are some places. Sometimes it's a town that's been planted in the middle of nowhere, perhaps near the railroad line, but it never happened. And some of those places, like Shady Rest, have become recreational areas where you can uh, bring together uh, people with horses and sulkies and buggies, and they can get together just the same way as people get together in recreational vehicles these days. But it was a local, and so sometimes those unplanted towns, or those planted towns that were unutilized, uh, have been taken over for recreation, and I like to think also for preservation. But you have to be fairly uh, concerned to and driven to make sure that the preservation side is there. Wide trails will really mess us over uh, in terms of preservation. Sometimes farmers have been very good, very understanding of what we're trying to do, but they also are tempted to invade or uh, just move over and plow the very undisturbed edges that we want to preserve for for prairie preservation and for which we bought the land. So we are worried about places like uh, Farmer City. What changes are going to occur? There's a live railroad line going north south, uh, and it empties a very large elevator. And how do you get uh, hikers and bikers across with that sort of situation? Where would you find a restaurant that's near the railroad, that's near the people who might visit? People are riding across the country. There's a rail to trail movement which has care of or looks over uh, this part of 30,000 miles of abandoned railroad trail. And uh, most all of this is very friendly, but it takes a while to settle down as that. Uh, One of the first attractions is a bicycle shop somewhere because bicycles do break down, and there's a need for rescue, and there's a need for maintenance. Restaurants are in there, rest areas, little parks, and the like. So these corridors can upgrade a town considerably and change it some. So you have funereal areas. Farmer City has interesting graveyards where I don't know the date, but I think it must be in the 20s, the 1920s area. It was popular to carve limestone so it would look like a tree with all the annual rings. It would have the arms of the branches were broken to indicate the last of life. There were little animals running around. There were squirrels and the like. There are snakes. There are arum lilies. There are drummer boys. These were rather fantastic, and the Farmer City has a cemetery with a lot of them. Not everyone appreciates them. Some people actually get rid of them, but meetings of funereal interested people often attend or visit in a field trip to Farmer City. There are old graves. So you don't want a crowd of people to be running over your history. How can it be organized so it can be attractive and interesting? People have the time to be interested, and they're going to come to your territory and be curious. And there's a little bit of fear that this is a loss of privacy, but really it isn't. And it takes about 10 or 15 years. People have to get used to this, but often people who have adjacent territory and they back up onto the railroad, especially in urban situations, and there's a fear that they might be broken into. There's very little violence associated with these trails. The first creatures that get involved are dogs. They like to talk to the people, and they get to be very friendly, and the owners of the dogs get to be friendly. And so you need places where people can get together. You need places like motels, hotels. You need places where you can find out about the place. What's the geology? What was the settlement pattern? Is there a simple museum that might be open for people to come through and enjoy? So I was writing to remind Farmer City that we don't know about the virus. It might stop things, but it's slated that a rail trail will come through Farmer City. And do you retain any of the remnants of the railroads? Sometimes places that were on the railroad and dependent on the railroad and built because of the railroad retain an engine. So we have a Monticello Railroad Museum, and it plays a historic role. And so where would you keep a little line? Could you buy a caboose? Could you have the caboose as a museum piece? How can you interpret the farmland to people who may not know what corn and soybeans is? Can you have a live farm where people could stay for the night? There are a lot of opportunities, and people need to dream. So I got a letter back, and they asked if they could put my information into the Mirror publication. And I said yes, and I added some things to it because my first contact was cautious, because you don't want to get involved in telling people what to do. It's their community. They've come here from overseas. They've come to rich soil and rich rainfall, and they're fairly independent. So somehow you have to suggest some of these things very carefully. And I could do a little more when I had a response from historic people and genealogical people who would like to include my information there. In the next mirror that comes out, there's a little booklet that deals with families and history and dramatic situations. There may have been a tornado at some times. There may have been interesting interactions with people, especially if they lose track of each other and eventually they find each other. And it's rather marvelous. But there is a seasonal agriculture, and that is good to see. I'm going to say that we need to get from Mansfield into Champaign, and it requires some of you to go poking around to see how you could get there. We have 23 miles between Whiteheath and Clinton, and it includes Lodge, DeLand, Weldon, Lane, and two state parks. One is Clinton Reservoir State Park and the Weldon Springs State Park, both of which are fairly crowded. So if we don't have access to Champaign because it's used for taking grain out from West Champaign and Mahomet to a main line that goes north and south. So we don't have a railroad abandoned to use. So you need to figure out, Farmer City is about 7 miles from DeLand, and actually that could be a place where you could send a bicycle or hikers if they want, and join up with a Heartland Pathways corridor through to Monticello, to Whiteheath and Monticello and Shady Rest and places that are on the Sangamon River. And I want some of you in Champaign to be looking at this, because Champaign-Urbana uses the counties around them. Vermilion, Piatt, Macon, McLean, these adjacent lands, even up to Ford County in the north, Iroquois County. We use this as our recreational base. And I think you should be out there too, finding out how we could get connectivity between Bloomington and Farmer City and Mansfield and into Champaign. And it's your homework for the session. I'm going to finish now because I sometimes run over. And this has been Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And have a good season, as good as you can have. Look at all the alternatives and do the best. And lots of understanding. And so thank you. This is Dave Monk.